Late July, 1891, Monte Carlo. Inside the most famous casino in Europe, the night is moving the way it always does. The chandeliers are burning, the wheels are spinning, rich men lose money quietly, and the croupiers rake in the chips with the calm of people who know the math is on their side. Then, a small Englishman walks in, 50 years old, bald, plainly dressed. Nothing about him looks like much. In his pocket is 4,000 pounds. The money is borrowed. The story he told to get it is a lie, and the man carrying it has spent years selling inventions that never existed. To the casino, he looks like every other gambler who thinks he has cracked the game, so they let him play. At first, nothing seems unusual. He bets red, then black, odd, even, wins a little, loses a little. Then the pattern changes, and the wheel starts giving him what he wants, again and again and again. By midnight, the table's reserve is gone. The croupiers stop the game and lay a black cloth over the felt. The casinos signal that the bank has been broken. It should have ended there. It doesn't. The second reserve goes, then the third, then the fourth. Staff are sent down to the vault. Sacks of gold are carried up the marble stairs. Players abandon their own tables to watch the quiet Englishman pulling money out of Monte Carlo, one spin at a time. By morning, he has won close to £1 million. The casino hires detectives. Reporters pick apart his bets. The croupiers replay the night in their heads. No device, no partner, no signal, no single proof of cheating. Nothing. Literally nothing. And that's what makes the story impossible. Charles Wells wasn't just a lucky gambler. He was a fraudster, a man who failed at nearly every invention he ever claimed to build, except maybe one, a way to make the wheel obey him. To understand why that night mattered, you have to know who Wells was before it. He was not born a criminal, not on paper anyway. Charles DeVille Wells was born in England in 1841, into a family that looked respectable from the outside. His father was a lawyer and a poet, the kind of man with books on the shelves and a reputation to protect. The young John Keats once wrote a sonnet to him. Charles did not stay in England long. While he was still a child, his family moved to France, and he grew up around Marseille, near the ports and shipyards and the machinery that ran the modern world. For a while, it looked as though he might become exactly what he later claimed to be, an inventor. He worked as an engineer. He understood machines, pressure, timing, friction, balance. In 1868, he made something real, a device to regulate the speed of a ship's propeller. He sold the patent for 5,000 francs, roughly 5 times a year's wages. For most men, that would have been the start of a career. For Wells, it became something else, because he had found a discovery more profitable than building machines, selling the dream of them. He no longer needed to create anything. He needed drawings, technical language, confidence, and people who wanted to believe they were getting in early on the next great idea. A retired officer chasing one last fortune, the widow with savings, the businessman who wanted to feel cleverer than anyone else. He would sit across from them and describe inventions that sounded plausible enough to be true. A railway that would change travel, a fuel-saving engine for steamships, a torpedo that could move through the water and catch fish, a musical skipping rope for children. Some of the ideas were absurd. Some sounded brilliant. None of them existed. The patents looked convincing. The drawings were clean. The promises were enormous. And when the money arrived, Wells disappeared. He did it in France first, then England, then under false names, then through hundreds of newspaper ads. One investor handed him almost 19,000 pounds, close to $2 million in today's money. Wells spent all of it and returned none of it. By 1891, the pattern was catching up with him. Investors were asking questions. The fake addresses no longer held. Old victims were closing in. He was 50 years old, and the schemes that had carried him for decades were falling apart. He needed money, and not slowly. So he found one more investor and told him about a device that could save fuel on steamships. The investor handed over 4,000 pounds. Wells did not build the device. He did not rent a workshop or hire a single engineer. He took the money, boarded a train, and went south. Not to escape, to gamble. In 1891, Monte Carlo was not just a casino. It was a machine built to turn human hope into money. The building sat on the Riviera like a promise. Marble floors, velvet curtains, tall mirrors, music, smoke, perfume, gold. Every detail was designed to make losing feel like an elegant thing to do. People came from across Europe to convince themselves they were different from every gambler who had come before. They were not, and the casino knew it. The Blanc family, who ran the business, had built the whole place on a simple truth. Gamblers remember their wins and explain away their losses. And the house did not need to cheat anyone. No loaded dice, no marked cards, no crooked dealers. It had something better: mathematics. European roulette has a single green zero, and that one pocket tilts every bet slightly toward the house. Not by much, just enough. On one spin, anything can happen. A man can win once, twice, 10 times in a row. But over thousands of spins, the edge always shows itself, slowly and without emotion. The casino did not have to beat every gambler in a night. It only had to keep them playing. Which is why the casino was not afraid of winners. Winners were useful. When someone broke the bank, the story traveled through hotels and cafes and trains, and every gambler who heard it thought the same thing. Maybe I can do it too. The casino even built a ceremony around it. When a player drained a table's reserve, the staff laid a black cloth over the felt. The bank was broken. The game paused. The table was refilled. The room buzzed. Then the wheel spun again. The black cloth was not a disaster. It was advertising. There was only one thing the casino could not afford: a man who could break the bank on purpose, because that would mean the machine was not perfect. And if the machine was not perfect, Monte Carlo was not invincible. 18 years before Wells arrived, another Englishman had already shown the casino what could happen when the wheel was not truly random. His name was Joseph Jagger. He was no nobleman, no famous gambler, not the sort of man Monte Carlo expected to fear. He came from Yorkshire, where he had spent his life working around textile machines. And that mattered, because men who work around machines know something gamblers forget. A machine is not an idea. It's an object. It wears down. It leans. A roulette wheel can look perfect from across the room, but if one pocket sits a fraction deeper or one bearing is worn, the results stop being random. Not enough for a casual player to notice. Enough for a patient man with a notebook. So Jagger did not walk in and start betting. In 1873, he hired 6 clerks and sent them in to do nothing but watch the wheels and write down every number, spin after spin, for days. Then he took the numbers home and found a pattern. One wheel was favoring a particular set of numbers. He went back, bet only on those numbers, and won. When the casino quietly switched the wheels between tables, he spotted a scratch he had memorized on his wheel's frame, found it again, and kept winning. They stopped him eventually, but the lesson stuck. After Jagger, the casino grew careful. Wheels were inspected, bearings were checked. By 1891, they believed those days were behind them. The wheels were clean, the system was safe. Then, Charles Wells sat down. The strange thing is that Wells did not play like a man chasing a miracle. He started quietly. No speech, no drama, nothing that made the room turn. Just simple bets. Red, black, odd, even, the same as everyone else. Then the balance tipped. A win. Then another. Then another. The croupiers had seen lucky runs before, but this was different. Wells was not behaving like a lucky man. He did not laugh or call for champagne or throw chips around the table. He was controlled, almost too controlled. The wheels spun and the money kept sliding toward him. At one stretch, he reportedly took 23 spins out of 30. On a fair wheel, that should almost never happen. Nobody in the room had time to do the math. They only watched the reserve shrink. The first broken bank was impressive. The second was alarming. By the third, The casino was no longer dealing with a lucky player. It was reacting to him. Cashiers came and went. Reserves were brought forward. A messenger was sent to the vault. The black cloth went over the table. Then over it again. The crowd gathered, leaning in for every spin as if the ball carried a secret. Wells gave them nothing. No explanation, no expression, no mistake. He just kept playing. By the early hours, the whole casino seemed to slow down around one table. The music faded into the background. The other gamblers became an audience, and somewhere in that room, Camille Blanc was watching. He understood the place better than anyone. The house could survive a lucky winner, a lost reserve, a headline. But this was not one table broken once. This was one man taking money from the casino over and over while nobody could explain what they were seeing. By sunrise, Wells had won close to 1 million francs. The casino had lost a fortune. Worst, it had lost its certainty. Wells stood up, gathered his winnings, and walked out. The story spread before he had even left town. By the time the next train pulled out of Monte Carlo, Wells was no longer a gambler. He was a headline. The man who broke the bank. Simple, musical, impossible to ignore. Newspapers across Europe ran it. Some believe Wells had found a system. Others were sure he had simply been blessed with luck so extreme it looked like mathematics. Monte Carlo had a problem. In public, it could not show fear. To admit Wells might have a method was to admit the game could be beaten. And the casino was not really selling roulette. It was selling confidence. That the wheel was fair, the edge was small but permanent, and every player had the same shot at glory. Behind closed doors, though, it had to know this was not normal. So detectives followed him. They watched where he went, who he met, what he carried. They were looking for an accomplice, a signal, a device, a bribed croupier. Anything that would turn the impossible into the ordinary. They found nothing. That's what made Wells dangerous. Not that he won, that nobody could prove why. If he had been caught cheating, the story would have ended cleanly. Expose him, ban him, protect the tables, move on. Instead, there was only a quiet Englishman with a fortune and no explanation. When reporters asked him how, he gave them everything and nothing at once. A system, he said. Mathematics, patience, luck. Anyone could do it with enough discipline. It was a perfect answer because it explained everything and revealed nothing. The public loved it. The casino hated it. A man who had spent his life selling fake inventions had now sold Europe the most valuable one of all, a mystery. Then, 4 months later, he came back. That is the part that makes the story hard to write off as luck. A man can have one impossible night. Probability allows it. Strange things happen when enough wheels spin for enough years. But Wells returned to Monte Carlo in November 1891, and he won again. And the casino let him. On paper, that looks insane. If they suspected a method, why let him near the tables? Because Monte Carlo understood something most people did not. Wells was costing them money, but he was also making them famous. Every article sent more gamblers to the Riviera. Every rumor about his system convinced ordinary people the casino could be beaten, and that belief was profitable. The Blancs had built the whole place on exactly that dream. Wells was not only a threat, he was an advertisement, a walking myth whose victories made thousands of others want to lose trying to copy him. But they were still watching, because if he won again and again, the legend could curdle into something else, a weakness. The details of that second visit shift depending on which account you trust, but the result was the same. Wells broke the bank again. Now, Europe had a story it could not let go of. The man had not just beaten Monte Carlo once, he had come back to the scene and done it again. And still, nobody could prove how. The story grew too big for the newspapers, so it moved to the stage. A music hall writer named Fred Gilbert saw the headlines and understood at once that Wells was more than news. He was entertainment. The image was irresistible. A quiet Englishman walks into Monte Carlo and empties the tables. Gilbert wrote a song. A performer named Charles Coburn made it the centerpiece of his act and carried it around the world in more than a dozen languages. And soon, people who had never set foot in a casino do the chorus. It made Wells folklore. His name traveled further than he ever did. For most men, that kind of fame would have been enough. For Wells, it was another insult. The performers made money. The theaters made money. The casino made money. And the man at the center of it did not see a penny of the song. He had beaten Monte Carlo and still found a way to feel cheated. That was who he was. Not a man satisfied by money, but a man who believed every room owed him more. In January 1892, Wells returned to Monte Carlo a third time. The miracle did not repeat. The wheel that had seemed to obey him was silent, and he lost. Not everything, but enough, about 100,000 francs. Most gamblers in his position would still have been rich. He could have vanished, paid his debts, lived quietly, and protected the one thing that made him famous. But Wells had never been that kind of man. He did not want enough. He wanted more. And when Roulette stopped handing it to him, he went back to the only system he had ever truly mastered: fraud. He had money now, and fame, and a story nobody could resist, so he used all of it. He bought a steamship and rebuilt it into a private yacht with a ballroom that could seat 50, and named it the Palais Royal. He entertained investors aboard it and spoke of grand shipping ventures, presenting himself as the man who had beaten Monte Carlo and was now moving on to something larger. People believed him because they wanted to, the same way they had believed in the railway and the torpedo and the fuel-saving engine. But behind the yacht and the charm and the famous name, nothing had changed. There was no empire and no future. Only Charles Wells, spending other people's money as fast as he could take it. And this time, the police were closer. In late 1892, the game ended on the deck of his own yacht. 2 French detectives boarded the Palais Royal in the harbor of Le Havre. They had been tracking him for months. Wells had spent years slipping through legal cracks, changing names, crossing borders. But there was nowhere to run from the deck of a ship. The man who had walked out of Monte Carlo with a fortune was arrested like any other swindler. No black cloth, no crowd, no applause. Just the quiet end of a performance that had run too long. He was extradited to England and tried at the Old Bailey in 1893. The court did not care about Monte Carlo or the song or whether he had beaten Roulette with luck or mathematics. It cared about the people he had ruined. The jury found him guilty on 23 counts of fraud. 8 years. For a man who had once emptied Monte Carlo's tables, the punishment was brutally ordinary. A cell, a routine, silence. And in one of the strangest details of his life, shortly before his release, he sat at the organ in the prison chapel and played the song that had made him famous. Only now, the man playing it had nothing. Prison did not reform Wells. It only made him older. When he got out and went back to France, he tried to begin again. But he was famous now, and fame cut both ways. People recognized him. People also still wanted to believe in him. So he changed the shape of the con. In 1910, under the name Lucien Riviere, he opened a private bank in Paris. This time he was not selling a machine, he was selling returns. 1% interest a day, 365% a year. It should have sounded absurd, but desperate people do not always hear the numbers, they hear hope. Around 6,000 of them handed over their savings, 2 million francs in all. For a while, it worked the way these schemes always do. New money paid the old investors. The old investors took new ones, and confidence became proof. Then, it broke, the way they always break. When the authorities began to investigate, Wells fled to Britain with the money. The police traced him, exposed him, and arrested him in 1912. A Paris court gave him 5 more years, and the fraud did so much damage that France rewrote its banking laws afterward. A decade later, an immigrant in Boston named Charles Ponzi would run almost exactly the same scheme, and history would attach his name to it. Wells had gotten there first. He simply never got the credit. Charles Wells died around 1922, far from the chandeliers of Monte Carlo. No fortune, no casino table, no crowd leaning over his shoulder. Just a rented room, a much younger companion named Jeanette who had stayed with him through all of it, and the remains of a life built almost entirely on deception. He was buried in a cemetery in London. And the question never went away. How did he do it? The easy answer is luck. Monte Carlo preferred it. Luck was safe. Luck protected the casino. Luck turned Wells into a story instead of a threat. But luck gets harder to accept when the same man comes back and wins again. It gets harder when you remember he was an engineer, and that Joseph Jagger had already beaten Monte Carlo by reading a biased wheel, and that decades later, another gambler would do the same thing with nothing but patience, a notebook, and mathematics, and win in court for the right to keep the money. So maybe Wells did not walk into the casino hoping for a miracle. Maybe he had already spent days watching the wheels and writing down the numbers. Maybe he had found a small mechanical flaw, invisible to the crowd, invisible to the croupiers, but plain to a man who understood machines. A wheel a fraction off true. A pattern buried inside the randomness. It could explain why he stayed so calm, why he came back, why the detectives found no device, why he never needed an accomplice. The secret was not hidden under the table. It was spinning in plain sight. Of course, no one can prove it, and that is exactly what kept the legend alive. Wells spent most of his life selling things that never worked. The railway, the torpedo, the fuel-saving engine, the private bank, all of them promises, all of them lies. But for 11 hours in July 1891, inside the Casino de Monte Carlo, one thing in his life may have worked exactly as intended, not because he built the machine, but because he understood it. And if that's true, then Charles Wells did not beat Monte Carlo with luck. He beat it with the one skill he had spent his whole life only pretending to have. He saw the flaw in the machine, and for one night, before the world caught up to what had happened, he turned it into a fortune.